This is a demo of the Simon game that I built for the MSP430 microcontroller. So in front of us on the left, we of course have the launch pad, which is used to program the board. But on the right is the more interesting part, which is the breadboard design for this game. So as you can see, we have 4 LEDs to represent the 4 different colors for the game. And then surrounded by the LEDs are their corresponding buttons, which the user can control. We of course have a bunch of resistors for those LEDs, but something that's interesting that we have are these capacitors, which in tune with the internal resistance on the MSP430 create an RC circuit, which is essentially a low-pass filter, and that allows these buttons to be hardware debounced, so that when the user clicks a button, it doesn't register multiple presses if the button is not the most precise. So now, if I reset the game, it's going to give me a sequence of lights, at which point I have a specified amount of time to go back and key it in. If I get it correct, then it's going to come back and give me another sequence. The number of lights increases every time, and what happens is that if you happen to get it wrong, then it'll immediately feed back and tell you, okay, you lost by just holding the red LED constant. So this is known as the lose state. There's also a timeout, so if you don't answer in a certain amount of time, then you'll lose the game as well. So, for instance, if I do red, red, green like that, and then we do, say, blue, and then I can't remember what the sequence was, then in a certain amount of time, the game will time out and say that I lost. The pseudo-random number generator, which uses a bit shifting mechanism, currently uses the exact same seed in this first iteration. In future iterations, it will be done off of some sort of ADC sampling or off the internal oscillator. But for now, it's going to give the same sequences every time, since the seed is always going to be the same.
So taking a look at the code for the Simon project, one thing that's immediately apparent is that the code base for this project is very much larger than other things that we've seen in this class. I'm going to go over a couple of the more interesting parts of this program, notably how the program flows from the beginning of the game to the end. So here at the top, of course, we have lots of constant declarations to make the code a little bit more readable. And then, of course, some of our global variables to store the sequence that it generates, and then the user's input, as well as some lengths and the current positions to represent the state. When the main method is run, you'll notice that there's no while loop in here. The entire game is run off of interrupts. So once all of the initialization for all the buttons and the LEDs occurs, then we just generate a random sequence of numbers which correspond to colors, and then those get all driven by interrupts. So when we display the first LEDs for the sequence, we jump down to the display interrupt, which is down here, and what that does is it just sets the next number in the array as the current color and then displays that color. And then there are also some no color values in the sequence, so that there's a pause between each color. But then once that's all done, then we set up the next interrupt. So the next interrupt in this case being allowing button input, and as well as the timeout. So there's always a timeout. If the user doesn't enter something within a specified amount of time, then the game will automatically be lost. If that interrupt ever occurs, then we just go to this interrupt, which sets the lose state. But let's assume that the user keys in a button, at which point this interrupt will get called. And that interrupt just does a bunch of checks to make sure that it can check button input, because it's always going to get called when a button gets pressed. But when we're not ignoring buttons, it's going to figure out which one was pressed, and then update the user's input to whichever button was pressed. And then what it'll do is do this software debouncing, which I call ignore for a bit. And what that does is it blocks off all button inputs for a little while, at which point, at the end, it will call another interrupt, which happens to be this one down here, which disables. First it disables this software interrupt first. It turns off the LED, so that's a convenient thing. So that's actually cool because you can actually see on the board when you're playing the game where the software debouncing has happened, because whenever the light is on after you press the button, that's the period for which it's not accepting any more buttons. So afterwards, it checks to see if your current answer was correct, and if it was correct, then it will proceed to allow you to continue to enter more answers. If not, then it'll set you to the lose state. Something that I thought about was that, if we get to sequences where the user has to enter 16 numbers, it might be a little bit more difficult for them to enter that within the timeout limit. So every time that you enter a correct answer, it automatically lengthens the interrupt time for the timeout by 1,000 timer cycles. So you're not going to get screwed because you have a longer sequence. As long as you're entering correct answers, you should be able to have enough time to enter it. So, if you make all the answers correctly, then it'll set up another game sequence and then repeat the whole process over again. So it's a very interesting way to do it. There's no while loops. It saves as much power, I guess, as possible. But it was really neat to be able to do it kind of almost like a finite state machine, where the code is only basically running when the program needs it to, and shuts off the CPU otherwise. So that's the code.